On the cusp of the perfect day, her faithful dog does the impossible. He interrupts the wedding. What is he feeling that she can't see? Determined to follow his strange behavior, she faces a truth that will change her life forever. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains of Emily's childhood bedroom, casting delicate patterns on the walls. She sat in front of her vanity mirror, taking in her reflection as her heart fluttered with excitement. The ivory wedding dress she had dreamt about since she was a little girl fit her perfectly, hugging her figure with just the right amount of elegance. Her chestnut hair was pinned back in soft waves, adorned with a simple veil that added an angelic glow to her already radiant appearance. Today was the day. The day she'd marry Jason, the man who had swept her off her feet 2 years ago. Everything was going exactly as planned. Her mother, ever the perfectionist, had ensured every detail of the wedding was flawless, from the delicate floral arrangements to the handwritten place cards at the reception. It was the wedding Emily had always envisioned. At her feet lay Benny, her golden retriever, who had been her loyal companion since she was a teenager. His soft fur, now flecked with gray, felt warm against her bare feet as he lay with his head resting on his paws. Benny had always been more than just a pet. He was her protector, her confidant, and the one constant in her life through every twist and turn. Today, he was an important part of the ceremony, tasked with carrying the rings down the aisle on a small satin pillow tied to his collar. As Emily leaned down to scratch behind Benny's ears, she noticed his deep brown eyes watching her with an intensity she couldn't quite place. It wasn't unusual for Benny to be attentive. He had always been a sensitive dog, attuned to her emotions, but something about his gaze today felt different. It was almost as if he was trying to tell her something. "What's on your mind, Benny?" Emily murmured, her fingers brushing through his soft fur. "Are you excited about today?" Benny gave a small wag of his tail, but it was subdued, almost reluctant. Emily frowned. He'd been acting strangely for the past few days. Clingy, almost anxious. He followed her everywhere, even into rooms where he usually didn't bother to go, and his usual playful energy seemed dampened. "It's just the excitement," her best friend and maid of honor, Rachel, had said the night before. "Dogs can feel when something big is happening. He probably just senses all the chaos." Emily wanted to believe that. After all, the past week had been a whirlwind of last-minute arrangements, fittings, and family members pouring into town. Benny wasn't used to so many strangers around, and his advanced age probably made the commotion even more overwhelming. But as she studied his face, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. He seemed worried. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her mother's voice calling from downstairs. "Emily, the photographer is here. We need to get started on the pre-ceremony photos." Emily sighed and stood, smoothing the fabric of her dress. "Come on, Benny," she said, motioning for him to follow. Benny rose slowly, his movements stiff, and trailed her out of the room, his tail wagging faintly behind him. Downstairs, the house was buzzing with activity. The hair and makeup artists were putting the final touches on the bridesmaids, who were dressed in soft lavender gowns that complemented the rustic charm of the outdoor venue. The photographer was setting up his equipment, giving directions to Emily's mother about where the family portraits would be taken. "Emily, you look stunning," Rachel said as she rushed over to her, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the dress. "Jason is going to lose it when he sees you." Emily smiled, her nerves fluttering again. "I hope so." The next hour passed in a blur of photos, laughter, and excited chatter. Benny stayed close to Emily the entire time, his presence a comforting anchor in the midst of the chaos. But even as she laughed and posed for the camera, she couldn't ignore the small seed of unease growing in the back of her mind. Benny's subdued behavior nagged at her. He wasn't eating as much as usual, and he seemed tired, almost drained. "Are you sure he's okay?" Rachel asked at one point, crouching down to stroke Benny's fur. He seems off. I think he's just feeling the stress of everything, Emily replied, though her own uncertainty lingered in her tone. He's old, you know? Maybe this is just harder on him than I thought. Maybe, Rachel said, but her expression mirrored Emily's concern. As the time for the ceremony drew nearer, Emily's mother bustled into the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Emily, darling, we need to leave soon. The guests are starting to arrive. Emily nodded, her excitement momentarily pushing aside her worries. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. She gathered her skirts, taking one last look in the mirror before turning to Rachel. "Let's do this," she said with a grin. But as she started toward the door, Benny moved to block her path. He stood firmly in front of her, his body pressed against her legs, and let out a low whine. Emily stopped, startled. "Benny, what are you doing?" she asked, reaching down to gently push him aside. But he wouldn't budge. "Maybe he doesn't want you to leave," Rachel said with a small laugh. "It's like he knows this is a big step for you." Emily chuckled, though the unease in her chest tightened. "He's always been overprotective. He'll be fine once we get there." Benny finally moved, albeit reluctantly, and followed Emily and Rachel to the car. As they drove to the venue, Emily couldn't help but glance down at Benny, who had his head resting on her lap. His eyes, filled with that same intensity she had seen earlier, never left her face. "It's just nerves," she told herself, stroking his fur. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Benny was trying to tell her something. She just didn't know what. The historic stone church stood majestically under a cloudless sky, its spire piercing the crisp autumn air. The soft hum of arriving guests, the distant melody of a string quartet warming up, and the golden hues of late afternoon sunlight painted a picture of perfection. Emily stepped out of the car, her gown shimmering as she adjusted her veil. Benny, his tail wagging faintly, hopped out after her, the small satin pillow carrying the ring securely tied to his collar. "This is it, Benny," Emily whispered, crouching to stroke his fur. "The big moment." Benny looked up at her, his warm brown eyes holding an intensity that made her pause. He leaned against her leg, his weight solid and grounding, as if silently telling her not to move forward. She brushed off the feeling, attributing it to her own jitters. Rachel and the bridesmaids hurried to organize the bridal party, their chatter filling the cool air as the photographer began snapping pre-ceremony photos. Emily posed for a few shots, smiling brightly, but Benny's behavior tugged at her focus. While the photographer directed the wedding party, Benny refused to leave her side, positioning himself between her and the group whenever possible. His behavior elicited laughter from a few bridesmaids, but Emily felt the unease in her chest grow heavier. "Benny, come on," she said gently, trying to coax him away so the photographer could get a clear shot. But Benny didn't move. Instead, he pressed closer, his nose nudging her hand as his low whine filled the air. "Maybe he's just nervous about all the people," Rachel offered, though her voice held a note of doubt. "Yeah, maybe," Emily replied, though the tightness in her stomach told her otherwise. She bent down, her gown pooling around her feet, and looked into Benny's eyes. "What's wrong, buddy? You're acting so strange today." Before she could linger on the thought, her mother's sharp voice cut through the air. "Emily, we need to start the ceremony. Guests are seated, and the minister is ready." Emily straightened, giving Benny one last pat before joining the procession line. The bridesmaids took their positions, the flower girl practiced scattering petals, and the string quartet shifted seamlessly into the opening chords of Pachelbel's canon. As the doors to the church opened, the cool stone interior glowed with candlelight, and all eyes turned to Emily. This was the moment she had imagined so many times. Jason stood at the altar, his smile broad and confident as he watched her begin her walk down the aisle. Her father held her arm, whispering encouragement as they moved forward. Benny padded beside her, his rings securely fastened, his presence a comforting constant. But halfway down the aisle, Benny stopped. Emily felt the tug on the leash and glanced down. Benny had planted himself firmly in place, his tail low, his body tense. He let out a sharp bark, startling the guests and halting the procession. Emily tugged gently on the leash, her heart pounding with a mix of confusion and embarrassment. "Benny, come on," she whispered urgently. "This isn't the time for this." But Benny wouldn't move. He barked again, louder this time, and positioned himself directly in front of her, blocking her path. Gasps rippled through the crowd as murmurs filled the air. "Is he okay?" her father asked, concern flickering across his face. "I don't know," Emily replied, kneeling beside Benny. She ran her hands over his body, checking for any signs of injury or distress. His heart was racing under her palm, and his breath came in quick, shallow pants. His eyes locked onto hers, pleading and insistent. The minister, clearly uncomfortable with the disruption, cleared his throat. "Shall we continue?" Before Emily could respond, Benny barked again and tugged at the leash, pulling her toward the side of the church. The guests whispered among themselves, unsure of what was happening. Her mother, seated in the front row, looked mortified. "Emily," Rachel called softly from the side, "do you want me to take him outside?" "No," Emily said firmly, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." Her father, sensing her distress, knelt beside her. "What do you want to do, sweetheart?" Emily glanced toward Jason at the altar. His smile had faltered, and his hands were clenched tightly in front of him. She looked back at Benny, whose entire body seemed to vibrate with urgency. "I need a moment," she said, rising to her feet and turning to face the guests. Her voice carried across the church, steady despite the whirlwind of emotion swirling within her. "I'm so sorry. Please excuse me for just a moment." Guided by Benny's insistent tugs, Emily moved to the side aisle. Her father followed, his face a mask of confusion and worry. Benny led them toward the exit, stopping only when they were outside, away from the prying eyes of the congregation. "What is it, Benny?" Emily asked, her voice breaking. "What are you trying to tell me?" Before she could collect her thoughts, a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Emily!" She turned to see her distant cousin Mark, who had flown in for the wedding from out of state. He looked nervous, glancing over his shoulder before stepping closer. "Mark?" she asked, confused. "What's going on?" Mark hesitated, his gaze flickering between Emily and Benny. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but I can't let you go through with this without knowing the truth." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What truth?" "It's about Jason," Mark said, his tone grave. "There are things you don't know about him, things that might change your mind about marrying him." Emily's mind reeled. She opened her mouth to respond, but Benny's bark cut through the air, sharp and commanding. It was as if he was confirming Mark's words, urging her to listen. "What do you mean?" Emily pressed, her voice trembling. Mark sighed and began to explain, his words unraveling the carefully constructed image of the man waiting for her at the altar. With every revelation, Emily felt the ground beneath her shift, her dreams cracking under the weight of a truth she could no longer ignore. Benny stood beside her, his presence steady and unyielding. He had brought her here, away from the altar, away from a life built on lies. And for the first time that day, Emily understood what he had been trying to tell her all along. The crisp autumn air was no longer comforting. It felt heavy, almost suffocating, as Emily listened to Mark's words. Each sentence he spoke chipped away at the perfect image she had built of Jason, the man she had trusted, the man she was moments away from marrying. Mark's voice was low, careful but urgent. "I didn't want to ruin your day, Emily. That's why I didn't come to you sooner. But when I saw your dog, the way he acted, I knew I couldn't keep quiet." Emily clutched Benny's leash tightly, her knuckles white. "What are you talking about, Mark? What's wrong with Jason?" Mark hesitated, his gaze darting to Benny, who sat protectively by her side, his body still tense. Finally, he took a deep breath. Jason's not who you think he is. He's been hiding things from you. Serious things. Like what? Emily demanded, her voice trembling. For starters, his finances, Mark said. I work in the banking industry, and I came across his name on some documents a few months ago. He took out a massive loan, Emily, tens of thousands of dollars, and it wasn't for anything legitimate. It was to cover debts from a failed business venture he never told you about. He's been using that money to stay afloat, but he's drowning in debt. And the worst part, if you marry him, you'll be legally tied to all of it. Emily felt her stomach drop. She had known Jason wasn't wealthy. He had always been upfront about his modest lifestyle, but he had never mentioned debts of this magnitude. He had never mentioned any debts at all. Mark continued, his expression pained. There's more. I heard rumors about another woman. At first, I thought they were just that, rumors, but I did some digging. Her name is Melissa. She's been in and out of his life for years, and from what I understand, she's still in contact with him. Emily, I'm sorry, but I think he's been lying to you about being faithful. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Emily reached out to steady herself on the stone wall of the church, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Benny pressed against her leg, his presence grounding her, his warm gaze unwavering. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This can't be true. Jason wouldn't do this. He loves me. Maybe he does, Mark said gently, but he hasn't been honest with you, and you deserve the truth before you make a decision that will affect the rest of your life. Emily's mind raced, replaying every interaction with Jason over the past 2 years. His evasive answers about work, the late-night phone calls he brushed off as just business, the way he sometimes seemed distant, even when they were together. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized existed began to fall into place, and the picture they formed was devastating. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. Why didn't you tell me this sooner? She asked, her voice cracking. I wasn't sure, Mark admitted. I didn't want to ruin what seemed like a happy relationship based on speculation. But now, seeing Benny stop you like that, I knew I had to say something. It's like he knew something wasn't right. Emily looked down at Benny, her loyal companion who had been with her through every trial and triumph. He had been acting strange for days, and now she understood why. He had sensed the turmoil, the lies, the danger she hadn't seen. Benny had always protected her, and today was no different. What do I do? She whispered, more to herself than to Mark. Mark placed a hand on her shoulder. That's up to you, Emily, but whatever you decide, do it with your eyes open. Don't let anyone pressure you into something you're not sure about. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. She crouched down beside Benny, wrapping her arms around him as he nuzzled into her shoulder. His presence, as always, was a source of comfort, a reminder that she wasn't alone. Thank you, Mark, she said, her voice steadier now, for telling me. Mark nodded and stepped back, giving her the space she needed. Emily stayed there for a moment, holding Benny and letting the weight of the revelations sink in. The music from the church filtered faintly through the thick stone walls, a distant reminder of the life she was about to step into, or walk away from. Finally, she stood, her resolve hardening. She knew what she had to do. She walked back toward the church, her steps slow but determined. Benny stayed close by her side, his tail wagging faintly as if sensing her newfound clarity. As she reached the doors, her father appeared, his face etched with concern. Emily, what's going on? He asked. The guests are waiting. Jason is waiting. Emily looked up at him, her tears dry but her eyes shining with resolve. Dad, I can't do this. Not like this. Her father's expression softened. Sweetheart, What happened? I found out the truth, she said simply, and I can't marry someone who's been lying to me. Her father's brows furrowed, but he nodded. If that's what you've decided, then I support you. We'll figure it out together. Emily took a deep breath and stepped into the church. The murmurs of the guests grew louder as she made her way down the aisle, not toward the altar, but toward Jason, who stood there with a confused smile. Emily, what's going on? He asked, his voice low enough for only her to hear. I know the truth, Jason, she said, her voice firm. About the debts, about Melissa, about everything. His face paled, and for a moment he looked like he might deny it, but then his shoulders slumped and he looked away. I didn't think you'd find out, not like this. I deserved to know, Emily said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. But you didn't trust me enough to tell me, and now I can't trust you. Jason opened his mouth to respond, but Emily held up a hand. This is over, Jason. I'm sorry, but I can't marry you. Gasps rippled through the congregation as Emily turned and walked back down the aisle, her head held high. Benny trotted beside her, his tail wagging, his role as her protector fulfilled. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the weight on her chest began to lift. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in days, she felt free. Benny looked up at her, his eyes shining with pride and love, and she knew she had made the right choice. Together, they walked away from the church, leaving behind the life that could have been and stepping into a new beginning. The golden afternoon light seemed softer as Emily walked away from the church, her steps slow but steady. The murmurs of guests faded behind her, replaced by the rustling of leaves in the cool autumn breeze. Benny trotted faithfully at her side, his leash slack in her hand, his wagging tail a quiet assurance that she had done the right thing. Her father caught up to her just as they reached the churchyard gate, his hand gently touching her shoulder. Emily, he said softly, his voice tinged with both concern and pride. Are you okay? Emily turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't know yet, she admitted, her voice trembling. But I couldn't go through with it, Dad. Not after everything I learned. It wouldn't have been real. He nodded, his expression understanding. You did what you had to do, and I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. She managed a small smile, her heart aching, but steady. Thanks, Dad. That means a lot. They stood there for a moment, the world around them quiet and still. Benny sat at her feet, his gaze fixed on her as if waiting for her next move. She crouched down and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into his fur. You knew, didn't you, Benny? She whispered. You always know. Benny nuzzled her cheek in response, his tail thumping against the ground. Emily smiled through her tears, feeling a swell of gratitude for the companion who had been with her through everything. Her father cleared his throat gently, breaking the moment. Why don't we head home? I'll take care of the guests, make sure everyone knows what happened. Emily straightened and nodded. Okay, but first, I want to say goodbye to a few people. She returned briefly to the church, her steps hesitant but purposeful. The guests were in varying states of confusion and sympathy, some whispering among themselves while others looked on with quiet understanding. Emily sought out Rachel, who rushed to her side the moment she saw her. Em, are you okay? Rachel asked, gripping her hands tightly. I will be, Emily said, her voice firm. Thank you for being here. I couldn't have done this without you. Rachel pulled her into a hug, and Emily felt the weight of her emotions eased just a little. When she pulled back, she saw Mark standing off to the side, watching her with a mixture of relief and concern. Mark, she said, approaching him, thank you for telling me the truth. I know it wasn't easy, but You saved me from making a huge mistake." He nodded, his expression serious. "You deserved to know, and I'm glad you listened." With her goodbyes said, Emily left the church for the final time, stepping into a new chapter of her life. Her father offered to drive her home, but she shook her head, choosing instead to walk with Benny. The familiar streets of her hometown stretched before her, offering a sense of comfort in their predictability. As she walked, the initial sting of heartbreak began to dull, replaced by a quiet resolve. She had made the right choice. She had trusted her instincts and Benny's, and now she had the chance to rebuild her life on her own terms. That evening, Emily sat on the porch of her childhood home, Benny lying at her feet. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. She sipped a cup of tea, letting the warmth seep into her as she thought about what came next. She didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt free. In the weeks that followed, Emily began to rebuild. She returned to the wedding gifts, canceled the venue, and slowly untangled herself from the life she had planned with Jason. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when she questioned everything. But Benny was always there, his quiet presence reminding her of the strength she had found within herself. She also started focusing on her own dreams, ones that had been overshadowed by her plans with Jason. Emily revisited the idea of opening her own floral design business, something she had always loved but never pursued seriously. With the support of her family and friends, she began taking small steps toward making it a reality. One crisp December morning, Emily and Benny were walking through the park when they encountered a man jogging with a sprightly border collie. The man, tall and kind-eyed, stopped to let the dogs greet each other. Benny, despite his age, wagged his tail enthusiastically, and Emily couldn't help but laugh. "Doesn't usually warm up to strangers so quickly," she said, looking up at the man. "Lucky me, then," he replied with a warm smile. "I'm Matt, by the way." "Emily," she said, her smile softening. Over the weeks that followed, Emily and Matt crossed paths more and more, their conversations growing longer and more meaningful. He was genuine, thoughtful, and kind, and Emily found herself drawn to him in a way that felt natural and unforced. Months later, on a sunny spring afternoon, Emily stood in a small garden surrounded by friends and family. This time, there was no grandiose ceremony, no elaborate plans, just a simple celebration of love and commitment. Benny sat proudly beside her, his tail wagging as she exchanged vows with Matt. As they walked back down the aisle together, Emily glanced down at Benny and smiled. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Benny wagged his tail in response, his gaze steady and full of love. Later that evening, as the sun set over their small reception, Emily sat with Matt and Benny on a blanket under the stars. She leaned into Matt's shoulder, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. Benny rested his head on her lap, and Emily stroked his fur, her heart swelling with love for the dog who had been her constant companion and protector. He had led her away from a path that wasn't meant for her and toward a life that was fuller, richer, and truer than she could have ever imagined. And for that, she would always be grateful. Emily sat under the starlit sky, Benny resting peacefully at her feet, his steady breathing a quiet reminder of the journey they had taken together. Beside her, Matt's hand gently held hers, a symbol of the new chapter she had found the strength to begin. The past no longer felt like a weight. It was a lesson, a path that had led her here. As Benny stirred in his sleep, his tail wagging softly, Emily smiled, feeling the warmth of hope and gratitude. Her life had changed in ways she could never have predicted, guided by instincts, trust, and the unwavering loyalty of a friend. Sometimes the hardest decisions lead us to the brightest moments. What would you do if your instincts told you something was wrong? Share your thoughts and let's talk about the choices that define us.